The morning sun rose slowly over Fort Liberty, casting long golden streaks across the neatly lined barracks. The air was crisp with autumn chill, carrying the sharp scent of dew-soaked earth and the faint tang of fuel from the base vehicles. Soldiers moved in precise, measured patterns, some jogging along the tracks, others performing synchronized drills, their boots striking the asphalt in a rhythmic percussion that echoed off the concrete walls. At the center of this disciplined chaos, Captain Emily Harris stepped out of her quarters, adjusting the crisp folds of her uniform, each insignia carefully polished to catch the first light of day. Emily's presence on the base was immediately noticeable, not just because of her rank, but because of the quiet, commanding aura she carried. Her dark hair was pulled tightly into regulation bun, but her eyes sharp, observant, and unnervingly calm scanned the grounds like a hawk surveying its territory. She had seen more hostile environments than this, in deployments across deserts and urban conflicts, yet something about Fort Liberty unsettled her. It wasn't the drills, the schedules, or the looming watchtowers. It was the invisible tension threading through the air, a subtle, insidious undercurrent that made each glance and gesture feel like a test. Colonel Richard Mason, her superior officer, was already overseeing morning inspections. A towering figure in a perfectly pressed uniform, Mason embodied the traditionalist ideals of the military in their most rigid form. His jaw was square, lined with age and authority, and his eyes cold, calculating, and wary followed every soldier with meticulous scrutiny. When he caught sight of Emily, a faint smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth, a gesture that did not escape her notice. This smirk, brief and seemingly casual, carried 1,000 unspoken words: doubt, dismissal, and the expectation that she would falter. Emily had heard the rumors before even setting foot on the base. Mason had a reputation, whispered in the barracks like a half-forgotten warning. He did not welcome change. He did not tolerate insubordination, and he certainly did not trust female officers. The stories were almost laughable, exaggerated tales of his stubbornness, but they were enough to make any newcomer wary. Emily, however, had built her career on navigating such challenges. She had faced environments that tested her resolve and had come out not just intact, but stronger. Still, the knowledge that Mason was actively skeptical of her capabilities created a pressure that clung to her chest like a second uniform, heavy and restrictive. Her first steps onto the parade ground were deliberate, measured, and confident, even though her mind cataloged every detail. She noted the alignment of the soldiers, the gleam of the rifles, the precision of the movements. Each action, though routine, was a testament to discipline, a discipline she respected and understood intimately. Yet there was a tension in the way the soldiers' eyes flickered toward her. Some were curious, others cautious, and a few openly dismissive. Emily recognized these expressions instantly. She had trained to read micro-expressions, the subtle twitch of an eyebrow or the fleeting curl of a lip. These details told her more about the culture of the base than any briefing ever could. As she reached the center of the grounds, Mason stepped forward, his boots clicking sharply against the asphalt. He didn't offer a handshake or a greeting. Instead, his gaze lingered on her insignia, scanning her uniform as if he could detect some hidden flaw. "Captain Harris," he said, his voice measured and authoritative, carrying easily across the morning air. There was no warmth in his tone, only scrutiny. "I trust you understand the procedures here." Emily met his gaze evenly, her posture straight and unwavering. "Yes, sir," she replied, her voice clear and composed. It was a simple acknowledgement, yet every word conveyed her competence. She did not need to defend herself. She had already done the work. Mason's smirk deepened slightly, almost imperceptibly, as if to say he expected her to stumble. The next hour unfolded with the standard morning drills. Soldiers marched in formation, rifles raised, voices unified in cadence. Emily moved among them, observing with meticulous attention. She noted the precision of those who excelled and the small missteps of others. Her mind catalogued everything: potential strategies, weaknesses in formations, and the personalities of the troops she would one day command. Despite Mason's presence, her focus never wavered. She had learned long ago that true leadership required patience, observation, and the quiet gathering of intelligence before action. Between drills, Mason approached her, his expression unreadable. "Captain," he said, lowering his voice so only she could hear, "I hope you realize that leading here is different from what you've experienced elsewhere." There was a pointedness in his tone, a suggestion that her previous accomplishments would hold little weight here. Emily nodded subtly, acknowledging his statement without allowing it to affect her composure. "I understand, sir," she said, her tone respectful but firm. "I'm here to serve and to learn." Behind his eyes, she detected the faintest glimmer of skepticism, a challenge, unspoken but palpable. Mason's type often relied on intimidation and subtle belittlement to test newcomers. Emily knew this, and she had prepared for it. She would not meet his tactics with anger or defensiveness. She would meet them with strategy, patience, and undeniable results. Every slight, every dismissive remark was a thread she could weave into her understanding of him and the base. The soldiers around them began to notice the interaction, their attention shifting subtly. Some exchanged quiet glances, curious about how this newcomer would respond. Emily's calm under scrutiny impressed a few, particularly the younger soldiers, who had never seen a woman command respect so effortlessly. Others remained skeptical, influenced by Mason's visible disapproval. Emily knew their opinions would take time to shift, but she also knew that actions always spoke louder than words. As the morning progressed, the base came alive with activity vehicles maneuvered through practice courses. Instructors barked instructions, and the rhythm of military life continued with clockwork precision. Emily walked through the chaos with deliberate intent, taking note of every detail, every misstep, and every opportunity. Her mind was alive with plans, not just for the drills, but for how she would assert her authority, earn the respect of her subordinates, and navigate the unspoken tensions that the colonel seemed to thrive on. By mid-morning, the tension in the air had become almost tangible. Emily paused at the edge of the parade ground, letting her gaze sweep over the assembled soldiers. Each face told a story: curiosity, doubt, loyalty, fear, ambition. She catalogued them silently, filing each observation away for later use. Leadership was not merely about giving orders, it was about understanding people, predicting their reactions, and inspiring them to follow, even when they might hesitate. Colonel Mason observed her from a distance, his expression a mix of curiosity, doubt, and perhaps grudging respect. He had faced countless officers in his career, but Emily Harris was different. There was a quiet intensity in her demeanor, a controlled confidence that refused to bend under scrutiny. He could sense it, even if he refused to acknowledge it outwardly. The morning was still young, but already the stage was set. The subtle battle of respect, authority, and perception had begun, and Emily was ready. By the time the sun climbed higher, bathing the base in bright light, Emily had completed her initial tour of inspection. She returned to her quarters briefly, taking a moment to review notes, jot observations, and mentally prepare for the first briefing with the colonel. The base, alive with routine, seemed almost unaware of the significance of her presence. Yet Emily knew that every step, every word, every decision would ripple outward, influencing the perceptions of soldiers and superiors alike. As she adjusted her uniform one last time before entering the briefing room, Emily took a deep breath. She was not here to prove her worth in words alone. She was here to act, to lead, and to redefine expectations. The base was her proving ground. Colonel Mason was her first obstacle. and the day ahead promised challenges that would test both skill and resolve. For Captain Emily Harris, the mission had only just begun, and Fort Liberty would never be the same. The briefing room at Fort Liberty was a stark, utilitarian space, designed more for function than comfort. Fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead, casting a pale glow over the long metal tables and rigid chairs. The walls were adorned with tactical maps, charts, and framed photographs of past exercises, each chronicling moments of discipline and precision that defined the base's storied history. Emily Harris entered quietly, her boots clicking softly on the polished concrete floor. The room, though bustling with officers and enlisted soldiers, seemed to shrink in her presence. She had learned long ago that first impressions were fleeting, but initial perceptions could linger long enough to influence the course of an entire career. Colonel Richard Mason was already seated at the head of the table, his posture rigid, his fingers steepled together in a gesture of deliberate authority. He had an almost predatory awareness, scanning each officer as though measuring their worth with a single glance. When his eyes settled on Emily, there was a subtle tightening of the jaw, a barely perceptible narrowing of his gaze that spoke volumes. He did not rise to greet her. He did not offer the civility of a handshake. Instead, his expression carried a silent challenge, a message that said, "You will need more than competence to survive here." Emily acknowledged him with a nod, maintaining the calm, controlled demeanor that had become her armor over the years. She understood the importance of this moment. The room was filled with officers whose loyalties and opinions would matter in the days and weeks to come. The whispers had already begun as she walked to her assigned seat. "She's young, inexperienced. Can she handle Mason?" Some were curious, some skeptical, and a few openly dismissive. Emily ignored the murmurs, focusing instead on the maps laid out on the table. This was her arena, and she intended to master it. The colonel began the briefing with his usual formalities, outlining the week's exercises and the strategic objectives of upcoming drills. His voice carried authority, yet it had a sharp edge. Whenever he referred to new approaches or ideas that deviated from his strict protocols, Emily listened intently, taking mental notes not just on the operational plans, but on the reactions of the soldiers around her. She observed the subtle shifts in posture, the tightening of jaws, the flickers of doubt or approval. Every movement, every glance, was a clue to the dynamics she would have to navigate. Finally, Mason's gaze returned to her. "Captain Harris," he said, the words measured, almost deliberate, "I trust you've familiarized yourself with our standard procedures. Innovation is appreciated, but it must be grounded in reality. We don't have the luxury of untested theories here." There was an unmistakable undertone of condescension in his voice, a subtle attempt to frame her competence as secondary to experience or lack thereof. A few officers exchanged uncomfortable glances, sensing the tension. Emily, however, felt a surge of clarity rather than intimidation. She had anticipated this. She responded evenly, her voice calm and unwavering. "Yes, Colonel. I have reviewed the procedures and the operational history of this base. I understand the importance of maintaining standards while seeking opportunities to improve efficiency and readiness." Her words were concise, professional, and deliberate, carrying the weight of someone who had prepared thoroughly. She did not seek approval, nor did she beg acknowledgement. Her goal was simple: to assert her presence without confrontation. The colonel's lips twitched into a faint, almost imperceptible smirk. "We'll see how well theory translates into practice," he murmured, more to himself than to her. The remark was casual, but Emily caught the full force of its intent, a challenge, an expectation that she would falter. She met his gaze directly, offering neither apology nor hesitation. Her silence carried its own quiet defiance, a message that she would not be undermined by words alone. As the briefing continued, Emily took her turn presenting observations from the base inspection earlier that morning. She pointed out minor inefficiencies in drill execution, noted areas where communication could be streamlined, and suggested subtle adjustments to troop deployment during exercises. Each comment was backed by precise observation and practical reasoning. A few officers nodded in agreement, impressed by her insight. Others, however, exchanged skeptical glances, wary of her youth and gender in a space historically dominated by men. The colonel's response was measured. He did not openly dismiss her suggestions, but he framed them as questions rather than affirmations. "Interesting, Captain. But have you considered the potential complications if the opposing unit were to respond differently? Are you confident your adjustments would hold under real-world conditions?" His tone carried more weight than the words themselves. A subtle attempt to challenge her authority without overt confrontation. Emily anticipated this line of questioning and was ready. "Yes, sir," she replied smoothly. "I have analyzed multiple scenarios, including contingencies for unexpected responses. My adjustments are designed to provide flexibility while maintaining operational control. I am confident that they can enhance efficiency without compromising readiness." There was no arrogance in her voice, only calm certainty. The room remained quiet, tension thickening with each passing moment. Some soldiers shifted in their seats, beginning to reassess their initial impressions of the young captain. A few minutes later, during the practical portion of the briefing, the colonel assigned Emily to lead a small team in a simulated command scenario. It was routine in appearance, but she knew Mason's intent. He wanted to test her ability under pressure, to see if she would falter when confronted with unfamiliar circumstances. Emily accepted the assignment without hesitation, her movements deliberate and composed. She reviewed the simulation parameters quietly, mentally mapping strategies and contingencies while observing the reactions of the soldiers around her. The team assembled quickly, soldiers uncertain of how to respond to their new leader. Some were tentative, testing boundaries, while others observed quietly, waiting to see if her competence matched her rank. Emily addressed them calmly, outlining the objectives and her plan with clarity. She anticipated resistance, both overt and subtle, and accounted for it in her instructions. By the time the simulation began, the initial skepticism had begun to shift. Soldiers noticed her precision, her ability to anticipate obstacles, and her calm control under scrutiny. Throughout the exercise, Colonel Mason observed silently, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Occasionally, he interjected with probing questions, designed to test her adaptability and decision-making under pressure. Emily met each challenge with focus, analyzing his questions, considering the implications, and responding with clarity. Her leadership was not loud or aggressive. It was firm, calculated, and confident. Slowly, the room's energy began to change. Officers and enlisted personnel alike started to recognize a quiet strength in her approach, a leadership that did not demand attention, but naturally commanded it. By the conclusion of the simulation, the initial skepticism that had greeted her entrance had shifted to cautious respect. Soldiers who had whispered doubts were now acknowledging her competence, some with subtle nods or brief exchanges of approval. Even those most loyal to the colonel began to reassess their assumptions. Emily's first impressions were no longer defined by doubt or curiosity. They were defined by performance, poise, and undeniable capability. After the exercise, the colonel called her aside privately. His expression remained guarded, but there was a subtle change, almost imperceptible, in his demeanor. "Captain Harris," he said, voice low and deliberate, "you handled that scenario competently. But understand this base has its traditions. You will need to navigate them carefully. One misstep, and the consequences are yours alone." The words were both warning and acknowledgement. Emily nodded, recognizing the underlying truth. Respect on this base would be earned through results, not words. As she returned to her quarters that evening, Emily reflected on the day's events. The first impressions had been challenging, but they were merely the opening chapter in what she knew would be a prolonged test of patience, skill, and resilience. The whispers, the glances, and the Colonel's calculated skepticism had revealed as much about the base's culture as any formal briefing. She had learned who would challenge her directly, who would follow cautiously, and who might eventually become an ally. Sitting at her desk, she reviewed notes and strategies for the coming days. Leadership, she reminded herself, was never about imposing authority. It was about observing, understanding, and acting with precision. Fort Liberty was a proving ground, and she had already begun to lay the foundation for her influence. The day's events, challenging as they had been, had also provided an opportunity to demonstrate what she had known all along. Competence, confidence, and careful strategy could overcome prejudice and skepticism, even in a place as rigid as a military base. As night fell and the base quieted, Emily prepared for sleep with a sense of clarity and resolve. The first impressions had been formed, but the story was far from over. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of authority, and new opportunities to assert her leadership. She would not falter. She would not retreat. Captain Emily Harris had arrived at Fort Liberty not merely to serve, but to lead, and the echoes of her first impressions would ripple through the base for weeks to come. The days following the initial briefing and simulation passed with a quiet intensity at Fort Liberty. Emily Harris quickly realized that surviving the Colonel's scrutiny was only part of the challenge. Earning the respect of the base itself would require patience, observation, and resilience. She moved through the corridors with a measured calm, noting every glance, every whisper, and every subtle sign of allegiance. Soldiers were curious, yet wary. Some admired her poise and intelligence, while others, still loyal to tradition and Colonel Mason's influence, regarded her with skepticism or thinly veiled hostility. Mason, as predicted, had begun a quiet campaign to test her limits. In meetings, he would pose questions designed to challenge her judgment, not out of necessity, but to see if she would falter under pressure. "Captain Harris," he would ask with deliberate casualness, "how would you respond if a unit disregarded your instructions during a live exercise?" The question was simple, yet loaded with the implication that she might fail. Emily responded each time with calm, structured reasoning, explaining contingencies and command protocols in a way that subtly displayed her competence, while maintaining professionalism. But it wasn't only the Colonel who made the environment challenging. Gossip and whispers in the hallways were relentless. Soldiers questioned her experience, some openly, others more subtly, planting doubts in the minds of their peers. "Do you really think she can handle command here?" one sergeant muttered to another as she passed. Emily heard these murmurs, though she did not respond to them directly. She had learned that confrontation was rarely necessary. Perception was shaped over time by actions and results, not arguments. She began working to quietly build alliances among the soldiers who were open-minded or observant. A young private named Malik, who had been skeptical of all officers, took note of her calm efficiency during drills. A seasoned sergeant, Ramirez, who had initially questioned her competence, began to respect the precision of her planning and the clarity of her instructions. By identifying those who were willing to look beyond prejudice, Emily started forming a network of subtle support. These relationships would prove essential as the base's tension grew. The Colonel's tactics became more apparent as the week progressed. He assigned her tedious administrative tasks that were beneath her rank, hoping to frustrate her and undermine her authority. Reports were scrutinized more harshly than others. Her recommendations were questioned even when accurate, and minor errors inevitable in a new environment were highlighted as evidence of incompetence. Each slight was calculated, a test of her resilience. Emily approached these challenges with quiet determination, never showing irritation, only steady focus on completing each task correctly and efficiently. The tension peaked during a coordinated field exercise intended to simulate a sudden crisis on base. Emily was tasked with overseeing communications and coordinating support from multiple units, a role that required both quick thinking and precise execution. As the exercise began, she noticed subtle resistance from some officers who were loyal to Mason. Orders were delayed. Some reports were incomplete, and there was a noticeable hesitation in following her directives. She recognized this immediately, not as defiance, but as a test, both from the colonel and the soldiers conditioned by his authority. Instead of confronting resistance with anger or frustration, Emily adapted. She restructured communication lines, prioritized critical information, and delegated responsibilities with care. Her decisions were deliberate and tactical, and slowly, the flow of the exercise began to stabilize. Soldiers who had initially hesitated now moved confidently under her direction, responding to her calm authority and clear instructions. By the end of the exercise, the operation had succeeded beyond expectations, and even some of Mason's loyal officers could not deny her effectiveness. Despite this, the colonel was far from appeased. He made a point to critique the operation publicly, highlighting minor oversights and questioning her strategic choices. "Captain Harris, while your execution was adequate, some elements lacked foresight," he said sharply, scanning the assembled officers. The words were meant to undercut her success, to remind the base that she was still the newcomer, still subordinate to the established hierarchy. Emily, however, maintained her composure, responding only with factual clarifications, avoiding confrontation, and allowing the results of the exercise to speak for themselves. Meanwhile, whispers of her competence began to circulate. Soldiers who had initially doubted her now discussed her skill quietly among themselves, impressed by her calm under pressure and the clarity of her decisions. Some approached her after the exercise, seeking guidance or clarification on procedures. Emily treated each interaction with equal respect and focus, understanding that earning trust was a gradual process, built through consistent behavior and reliability. She recognized the importance of patience in leadership, especially when navigating entrenched hierarchies and skepticism. However, the tension was far from resolved. Mason escalated his challenges in more subtle ways, testing her authority by manipulating scenarios designed to expose weaknesses. He assigned her units that were poorly prepared, questioned the logic of her decisions to subordinates, and even leaked information intended to create confusion among her team. Each move was a calculated effort to undermine her confidence and position. Emily faced these trials not with fear, but with measured analysis, carefully observing patterns and preparing strategies to counteract his tactics. The atmosphere on the base grew increasingly charged. Soldiers sensed the unspoken rivalry, and minor disagreements began to reflect the larger tension between tradition and innovation, skepticism and merit. Emily noticed the subtle alliances forming among the troops, those willing to follow her because they trusted her judgment, those still hesitant, and those actively resisting her influence. Understanding this social landscape was as crucial as the tactical operations she oversaw. Leadership required both strategic thinking and social intelligence. By midweek, the colonel's tactics reached their peak during a tactical simulation designed to test decision-making under pressure. Emily was assigned to lead a team through a series of unexpected challenges, including simulated equipment malfunctions and sudden changes in unit deployment. Some officers subtly withheld information or delayed responses, creating obstacles intended to provoke mistakes. Emily adapted rapidly, analyzing the situation, delegating tasks, and prioritizing critical objectives. Her calm decisiveness gradually overcame the artificial chaos, and by the end of the simulation, her team had not only completed the mission successfully, but had done so with remarkable efficiency. The colonel's reaction was muted, but Emily noticed the subtle shift in his demeanor, a slight tension around the jaw, a rare pause in his usually uninterrupted scrutiny. He had underestimated her ability to remain composed under pressure and to lead effectively despite opposition. Soldiers who had previously doubted her now witnessed firsthand her skill, reinforcing the quiet credibility she was steadily building. It was a small victory, yet a significant one, laying the foundation for the influence she would continue to establish on the base. In the aftermath, Emily reflected on the escalating tension. She understood that the colonel's behavior was not personal. It was a calculated response to any challenge to his authority. Recognizing this allowed her to navigate the challenges strategically rather than emotionally. Every slight, every critique, every whisper was an opportunity to observe, adapt, and strengthen her position. She had already begun to see patterns in Mason's approach and to anticipate his moves, turning his tactics into learning opportunities rather than obstacles. As evening fell over Fort Liberty, Emily returned to her quarters physically exhausted but mentally invigorated. The day had tested her patience, her leadership, and her resilience, yet she had emerged with her composure intact and her authority quietly reinforced. The base, with all its entrenched traditions and subtle hostilities, had begun to recognize that she was not merely a transient officer. She was a presence to be accounted for, a mind capable of navigating both tactical and social complexities. Sitting at her desk, Emily reviewed the events of the day, noting the moments of resistance, the small victories, and the subtle shifts in perception. Leadership, she reflected, was not about commanding respect through authority alone. It was about demonstrating competence, consistency, and integrity in the face of doubt. She understood that this battle, waged in whispers, glances, and minor provocations, was as critical as any tactical operation. Every interaction was a thread in the complex tapestry of influence she was weaving across the base. By the time the lights dimmed and silence settled over the barracks, Emily had made her first significant impression, not through overt confrontation, but through calm determination, strategic thinking, and quiet competence. The tension on the base remained, but she had begun to transform skepticism into cautious respect and suspicion into acknowledgement. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of authority, and new opportunities to assert her leadership. Captain Emily Harris had learned a crucial lesson. Rising tensions were inevitable in a space resistant to change, but they could be transformed into opportunities. Her resolve had been tested, her intelligence observed, and her presence acknowledged. The battle for respect was ongoing, but she was no longer merely surviving. It was clear that she was beginning to shape the environment around her. Fort Liberty, with all its traditions and rigid hierarchies, would remember the calm, precise captain who faced rising tensions with unwavering composure, and whose leadership quietly began to shift the base's culture. The morning air at Fort Liberty was colder than usual, carrying a crispness that hinted at the approaching winter. Emily Harris stood at the edge of the training grounds, reviewing her notes for the upcoming war simulation exercise. Unlike previous drills, this one would involve multiple units, high stakes, and real-time scenario changes, an event designed to push leadership, adaptability, and tactical skill to their limits. What Emily did not need to remind herself was that Colonel Mason would be watching every move, scrutinizing every decision, and waiting for any sign of weakness. The briefing began as usual, with Mason at the head of the table, his eyes scanning the assembled officers with that same cold, calculating intensity that Emily had come to anticipate. He outlined the parameters of the exercise with meticulous detail, emphasizing the challenges and potential pitfalls. But then, as the briefing shifted to Emily's assigned role, the colonel's tone sharpened. "Captain Harris," he said, almost theatrically, "I hope your plans are more than just theoretical. Remember, strategy is not about clever ideas, it's about results. Do not disappoint us." The words were subtle, yet heavy with condescension. Laughter rippled from a few of the colonel's most loyal officers, a kind of nervous chuckles that masked both anticipation and doubt. Emily met his gaze evenly, refusing to let even a flicker of irritation show. She knew that any reaction, defensive or emotional, would play directly into Mason's hands. Her strategy was to remain composed, rely on preparation, and let results speak louder than words. As the simulation began, Emily was placed in command of a squad responsible for coordinating multiple units under changing conditions. The exercise was designed to test adaptability, communication, and leadership under pressure, and it quickly became clear that the colonel intended to make this particularly challenging for her. Units under her command were intentionally delayed. Misinformation was introduced into her communication channels, and subtle errors were highlighted by the colonel's interjections. Soldiers whispered among themselves, unsure whether to follow or hesitate, further complicating her task. Emily paused for a brief moment, taking a deep breath as she assessed the unfolding situation. She recognized every tactic Mason was employing, not to teach, but to undermine. She did not panic. Instead, she quickly adjusted her strategy, rerouting commands through reliable channels, prioritizing critical objectives, and reassigning tasks to the soldiers she had already observed as competent and responsive. Her calm decisiveness began to counteract the chaos, instilling a subtle confidence in those around her. The colonel watched from a raised observation platform, his expression unreadable, but his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. It was clear he expected her to falter under the compounded pressure, to make a mistake that could be publicly dissected and used to reinforce his authority. Mason had spent years mastering the art of undermining capable officers, but Emily Harris was proving to be an anomaly. Every adjustment she made, every command she executed with precision, chipped away at his carefully constructed facade of control. Around her, the squad responded to her leadership. Soldiers who had initially hesitated now executed her directives with clarity and efficiency. When one unit reported a simulated equipment failure, Emily calmly issued a contingency plan, reallocating resources and reassigning roles to maintain operational flow. Her approach was methodical and strategic, yet infused with a sense of authority that went beyond orders. It inspired trust. The base, usually accustomed to rigid hierarchy and unquestioned obedience, began to notice a different kind of leadership in action. The turning point arrived during a critical phase of the simulation. A sudden scenario change intentionally designed by the colonel threatened to derail the exercise. Units were lost in the field, communication lines were disrupted, and a simulated enemy advance created urgency and potential chaos. Soldiers looked to Emily for guidance, and she responded without hesitation. She adapted quickly, issuing commands in rapid succession, delegating tasks with precision, and prioritizing objectives with clarity that left little room for error. By mid-exercise, it became apparent that her squad was outperforming expectations. Their movements were coordinated, their responses timely, and their simulated success rate far higher than any other unit on the field. The whispers of doubt that had accompanied her since arrival were fading, replaced by a growing sense of respect. Even soldiers who had been skeptical of her authority began to see the truth. Emily Harris was not just competent. She was exceptional. Colonel Mason, visibly unsettled for the first time, attempted to regain control of the narrative. "Captain Harris," he barked, raising his voice across the training grounds, "are you certain your adjustments will hold under live fire conditions? Remember, there is no margin for error." The challenge was direct and public, intended to test her composure in front of the entire base. Emily paused for a heartbeat, weighing her words carefully, then responded with unwavering confidence. "Yes, Colonel. These strategies have been tested and are adaptable to real-time changes. I am confident in my team and our execution." Her response, calm yet assertive, silenced murmurs across the field. Soldiers straightened, taking in her poise and certainty. Mason's eyes flicked from her to the squad, then back, as if realizing for the first time that the outcome might not follow his expectations. Emily seized the moment, maintaining steady control, delegating final adjustments, and ensuring that each unit was prepared for the final phase of the simulation. As the exercise concluded, Emily's team had achieved success beyond what was anticipated. Their coordination, efficiency, and strategic adaptability were evident to all observers, and the results could not be denied. Soldiers applauded quietly, acknowledging her leadership without fanfare, while some of Mason's loyalists exchanged reluctant glances, realizing that her competence was undeniable. Even the colonel, who had spent the exercise attempting to undermine her at every turn, could not ignore the results. The post-exercise debrief was tense. Mason, his pride visibly bruised, offered her restrained acknowledgement. "Captain Harris, your execution was, if not flawless, certainly effective," he muttered, choosing his words with care. There was no genuine warmth in his tone, but there was recognition and acknowledgement that Emily had not only survived his scrutiny, but had excelled despite it. Emily, as always, responded with professional courtesy, offering concise explanations and insights into her decision-making process. She did not seek to gloat. Her victory was in the results themselves. Around the base, the atmosphere shifted. Soldiers who had once whispered doubts now discussed her competence quietly but openly. Her poise under pressure, ability to adapt, and unwavering confidence had earned her credibility. For Emily, this was more than a personal triumph. It was a turning point in her relationship with the base, and a pivotal moment in redefining what leadership looked like in an environment resistant to change. As she returned to her quarters that evening, Emily reflected on the events of the day. The confrontation with the colonel, the unexpected obstacles, and the scrutiny of her every decision had all been part of a deliberate test, a test she had navigated with calm precision. The experience reinforced a critical lesson she had long known. True leadership was forged under pressure, and respect was earned through action, not words. Sitting at her desk, reviewing notes from the exercise, she allowed herself a brief moment of quiet satisfaction. She had faced the colonel's challenge head-on and emerged not only intact but triumphant. The simulation had revealed weaknesses in her subordinates' readiness, yes, but it had also demonstrated the undeniable truth of her capability. This was the moment the base and the colonel could no longer ignore. Emily Harris was a force to be reckoned with. As night fell over Fort Liberty, the lights in the training grounds dimmed, leaving only the faint glow of distant watchtowers. Emily prepared for sleep, not with arrogance or complacency, but with determination. The breaking point had been reached, and she had passed with distinction. Yet she knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of authority, and the ever-present scrutiny of Colonel Mason. The battle for respect and recognition was ongoing, and she was ready to meet it head-on. Captain Emily Harris had proven herself under the most intense scrutiny, facing public humiliation and unexpected obstacles with unwavering composure. The colonel's attempt to belittle her had failed spectacularly, and the base had witnessed a new kind of leadership, calm, decisive, and effective. The breaking point had arrived. The morning after the tactical exercise, the atmosphere at Fort Liberty was different. Even before the sun fully rose over the parade grounds, a subtle tension pulsed through the base, an awareness that something had shifted. Soldiers whispered in hushed tones as they moved through the barracks and training areas, exchanging glances that reflected a mixture of surprise, admiration, and cautious curiosity. The results of Captain Emily Harris's performance the previous day had spread quickly, carried by those who had witnessed her command firsthand. Her ability to navigate chaos with calm precision was no longer rumor, it was reality. Emily arrived early, as she always did, her footsteps silent against the polished concrete of the corridor. She was aware of the stir her presence created, yet she maintained her characteristic composure. Soldiers she had trained or observed during exercises now looked at her differently. Private Malik, once hesitant and skeptical, offered a respectful nod. Sergeant Ramirez, whose initial doubts had been thinly veiled, gave her a brief, approving smile. Subtle acknowledgments like these were powerful. They signified the quiet turning of allegiance, the first cracks in the colonel's long-established dominance. Colonel Mason, meanwhile, had been quietly assessing the aftermath. He had overseen countless officers in his decades of service, yet Emily's performance had unsettled him in ways few others had. The tactical exercise, designed to expose weaknesses, had instead highlighted her competence and composure under stress. Mason's pride, meticulously cultivated over years, bristled under the undeniable reality. The captain he had intended to undermine had excelled. The base had witnessed it. His authority, long considered unquestionable, had been subtly challenged in full view of his subordinates. During morning briefing, Mason attempted to regain his usual control. His voice carried its customary sharpness, each word measured with intent to assert dominance. "Captain Harris," he said, "your execution yesterday. Adequate. However, remember that operations in real-world conditions carry far more variables. Confidence alone will not guarantee success." There was no warmth in his tone, no acknowledgement of her skill, only the faintest trace of a begrudging concession. Emily, as always, met his gaze evenly, her posture composed, her expression neutral. She did not seek approval. The results had already spoken for themselves. As the briefing concluded, soldiers began to discuss the previous exercise openly. Conversations, once laced with doubt and hesitation, now reflected respect. She kept her cool even when everything went wrong. One officer whispered. "I've never seen anyone organize units so quickly," another added. Emily overheard snippets of these remarks as she moved between groups, offering guidance and clarification where necessary. It was subtle, but the acknowledgement was growing. Her influence was no longer aspirational. It was visible, measurable, and undeniable. The day's events escalated during a spontaneous tactical review, where officers and soldiers reenacted portions of yesterday's exercise to analyze decisions and outcomes. Emily took the lead, walking the troops through each movement, explaining her rationale, and highlighting both successes and minor errors for learning purposes. Her approach was not boastful. It was instructive. By sharing her reasoning, she provided soldiers with clarity and insight, further cementing trust and admiration. Those who had once whispered doubts now observed intently, eager to absorb her methods. Even those loyal to Mason could not ignore her capability. Several officers, previously aligned entirely with the colonel, asked questions during the review, seeking guidance on how to execute her strategies effectively. Emily answered each with patience and precision, never displaying condescension. Her professionalism began to shift the base's perception. Leadership was no longer merely about rank or tenure. It was about competence, composure, and clarity. Soldiers were recognizing a model of command that inspired confidence rather than fear. The tipping point came during an informal assembly later that afternoon. Word of Emily's performance had spread beyond the immediate participants of the exercise, reaching lower-ranking soldiers who had only heard fragments. Many gathered to observe her interactions, curious about the officer who had managed what they had been told was an impossible scenario. Emily, aware of their presence but undistracted, continued her work, reviewing tactical maps, refining deployment plans, and consulting with units. Her calm authority, even in this informal setting, reinforced her growing influence. At the same time, Mason watched quietly from a distance, his arms crossed, jaw tight. The whispers, the nods, the subtle gestures of acknowledgement, he saw them all. He could not openly admit it, but the base was recognizing her as a leader in her own right. The simulated scenario had provided undeniable proof of her capabilities, and soldiers were beginning to internalize the lesson. She was competent, composed, and capable of making decisions under pressure. Mason's attempts to belittle or undermine her had failed, and the impact was visible to all. Emily's recognition extended beyond the officers directly involved. During routine training sessions later in the day, lower-ranking soldiers sought her guidance, asking questions about tactical maneuvers, communication protocols, and decision-making strategies. She responded with patience, clarity, and encouragement, reinforcing her authority through action rather than assertion. The culture on the base, previously rigid and hierarchical, began to shift subtly. Where doubt had existed, trust and curiosity now took root. Where skepticism had dominated, respect began to emerge. By evening, Emily's presence had become a focal point for discussion across Fort Liberty. Soldiers who had once viewed her as an outsider were now quietly acknowledging her influence. Her calm decisiveness, coupled with strategic brilliance, had begun to reshape perceptions, illustrating a form of leadership that transcended rank alone. Even the colonel's most loyal officers had begun to adjust their behavior, following her instructions with increasing efficiency and subtle deference. Emily's impact was no longer theoretical. It was visible, tangible, and irreversible. The colonel's recognition, though begrudging, could not be avoided. Mason called a private meeting with Emily in his office later that evening. His posture was rigid, but there was a trace of caution in his tone. "Captain Harris," he began, choosing his words carefully, "you handled yesterday's exercise with efficiency. I will not deny that your execution exceeded expectations. However, remain aware that leading this base requires more than tactical skill. You must navigate the politics, the hierarchy, and the traditions that govern this place." Emily listened intently, her expression neutral, yet internally she noted every nuance. Mason's words were both acknowledgement and warning, a tacit admission of her capability, while reminding her that the challenges were ongoing. She responded professionally, concisely, and respectfully. "Understood, Colonel. I intend to continue executing my duties while respecting the structure and traditions of the base. I also hope to ensure that operational effectiveness and efficiency remain the priority." Her words were deliberate, calm, and reinforced the credibility she had begun to build. As she left the office, Emily reflected on the day's events. The shock and recognition of her achievements had transformed the base's dynamic. Soldiers now saw her as a capable leader. The whispers of doubt had been replaced by quiet admiration. Even the colonel's calculated attempts to belittle her had become opportunities to demonstrate composure and authority. Emily understood that recognition, like respect, was earned over time, and today had marked a significant milestone in her journey. That night, in the quiet of her quarters, Emily reviewed notes from the past week. She cataloged small victories, observed behavioral shifts among soldiers, and analyzed the subtle ways influence was beginning to spread. The base had begun to respond to competence rather than tradition alone. She understood that her recognition was not a static achievement, but a dynamic process that would require consistent demonstration of skill, judgment, and leadership. Captain Emily Harris had reached a pivotal moment. The base had witnessed her capability, the soldiers had recognized her authority, and the colonel had been forced to acknowledge her success, however grudgingly. The shock of her performance had begun to ripple across Fort Liberty, planting seeds of change in attitudes, allegiances, and perceptions. She had transformed skepticism into respect, subtle resistance into compliance, and whispers of doubt into quiet admiration. As she prepared for sleep, Emily considered the path ahead. A challenge had been met and exceeded. The recognition had begun. Yet she knew that sustaining influence, maintaining authority, And continuing to earn respect would require vigilance, patience, and relentless focus. Fort Liberty was changing, slowly but unmistakably, and she was at the center of that transformation. Her journey was far from complete, but the impact of her efforts had begun to be felt across the base. Captain Emily Harris had proven one undeniable truth. Leadership is earned through action, not rank. Through composure under pressure, not assertion. And through consistent competence, not favoritism. The shock and recognition of her achievements had set a precedent, altering the base's perception and laying the foundation for the battles and triumphs yet to come. And Emily had not only survived, it had been her defining moment. The stage was set for the next chapter, where her influence would grow, and her story would begin to ripple across the base in ways no one, not even Mason, could ignore. The morning fog clung to Fort Liberty like a soft gray blanket, obscuring the edges of the parade ground and the rows of barracks. Captain Emily Harris arrived early, her boots crunching on the damp gravel, her mind already racing through contingency plans for the day's exercise. This was no ordinary drill. Mason had announced a surprise tactical exercise designed to test adaptability, leadership under stress, and quick decision-making. Emily understood immediately. This was more than a simulation. It was another carefully constructed challenge, one meant to push her to the edge. Soldiers assembled in groups, whispering quietly among themselves. Many had observed Emily's performance in previous exercises, yet uncertainty lingered. The colonel's influence still weighed heavily, and his loyalists were watching her every move, searching for flaws. Emily ignored the glances, the murmurs, and the palpable skepticism. Leadership, she knew, required focus above all else. Every observation she had made about her squad in previous weeks informed her approach today. She identified the reliable, the hesitant, and the subtly defiant. Each would play a role in the strategy she was about to deploy. Mason's announcement came like a thunderclap. Captain Harris, you will lead a combined squad through an unexpected operational scenario. The objective is to secure critical locations while responding to simulated threats that will evolve in real time. Failure is not an option. His tone was sharp, deliberate, and public. Soldiers stiffened at the declaration. Emily, however, felt a familiar rush of clarity and determination. She had anticipated this level of difficulty, and her preparation had been meticulous. The exercise began with chaos. Simulated enemy incursions, disrupted communication lines, units were scattered, and false intelligence was deliberately injected into her operational channels. Mason's plan was obvious. He intended to overload her, testing not only her tactical skill, but also her ability to maintain composure under extreme pressure. Emily scanned the field, analyzing the terrain, the positions of her units, and the available resources. Every challenge, she realized, was an opportunity to assert her command and demonstrate her strategic thinking. Her first action was decisive. Emily quickly reorganized the scattered units, prioritizing critical objectives and assigning tasks based on each soldier's known strengths. The hesitation among some officers was immediate, subtle resistance testing her authority, but Emily maintained calm, giving clear, structured instructions that left no room for doubt. Her presence had a stabilizing effect. Soldiers who had previously been uncertain began to follow her lead, their movements more confident, their focus sharper. Midway through the exercise, a simulated equipment malfunction occurred in a key squad. Some officers whispered panic, unsure how to proceed, but Emily remained unflappable. She rerouted responsibilities, reassigned tasks to more reliable personnel, and integrated backup measures that she had prepared in advance. The operation continued smoothly, despite the artificial obstacles, and her team began to gain momentum, gradually taking control of the simulation rather than reacting to it. The colonel observed from his elevated position, arms crossed, his expression unreadable, but eyes sharp with scrutiny. He made subtle interjections, questioning her timing, her delegation, and her assessment of simulated threats. Each comment was intended to provoke hesitation or doubt, yet Emily met every question with calm precision. Her reasoning was clear, structured, and uncheckable, and her actions consistently reinforced her words. Slowly, she could sense the Colonel's carefully cultivated challenge beginning to unravel. A critical moment arose when the simulation introduced a sudden, unexpected threat, a coordinated enemy push targeting the squad supply line. Many would have panicked, allowing the artificial chaos to disrupt operations completely. Emily, however, had anticipated such scenarios. She quickly deployed a dual response. One team would intercept the threat directly, while another safeguarded the supply line, ensuring uninterrupted operation. Her instructions were concise, delivered without hesitation, and executed with precision. The squad moved as one unit, adapting fluidly to the shifting circumstances. The soldiers' reactions were telling. Those who had doubted her now moved with confidence, trusting her judgment without hesitation. Even the hesitant officers, previously loyal to Mason's vision of control, began to execute her directives efficiently. Emily recognized these subtle shifts, small but critical indicators of influence and authority. Leadership, she reflected, was as much about cultivating trust and confidence as it was about tactical skill. Today, she was testing both in equal measure. As the final phase of the exercise approached, the team faced a simulated extraction under extreme time constraints, with units reporting delays and communication breakdowns. Emily remained focused, adjusting her strategy in real time. She issued precise, prioritized commands, anticipating potential bottlenecks and reallocating resources to maintain operational flow. The soldiers responded with increasing confidence, their trust in her authority evident in every coordinated movement. What had begun as an exercise designed to overwhelm her had transformed into a demonstration of controlled, decisive leadership. By the conclusion of the simulation, Emily's team had not only achieved the objectives, but had done so with remarkable efficiency and minimal error. The exercise, meant to challenge her, had become a showcase of her capability. Soldiers who had doubted her competence quietly acknowledged her effectiveness, while those loyal to Mason were forced to confront an undeniable truth. Emily Harris was not just surviving these challenges, she was excelling. The Colonel, visibly restrained yet clearly unsettled, called her aside after the exercise. "Captain Harris," he said, his voice carefully measured, "you handled that scenario impressively. But understand, this real operations are unpredictable. Confidence alone is not enough. You will be tested again." There was no praise in his tone, only acknowledgement tinged with warning. Emily understood this implicitly. The Colonel's approval was never freely given, and his scrutiny would continue. Yet the impact of her performance rippled across the base. Soldiers who had initially hesitated now spoke of her competence openly, sharing observations of her strategic clarity and calm decisiveness. Some sought advice, while others simply watched, absorbing her methodology and adapting it in their own approach. Emily had begun to shift the culture subtly, not through confrontation, but through consistent, observable results. That evening, as Emily returned to her quarters, she reflected on the challenges she had faced and the victories she had quietly secured. The exercise had tested her patience, leadership, and strategic thinking under intense pressure, but it had also demonstrated the value of preparation, adaptability, and calm authority. She understood that the Colonel's tactics were designed to provoke mistakes and undermine confidence, yet she had turned them into opportunities to assert her capability and reinforce her credibility. Sitting at her desk, Emily reviewed the day's events in detail. She cataloged the decisions that had worked, the minor errors that had been corrected in real time, and the subtle changes in soldier behavior that reflected growing trust and respect. Leadership, she reminded herself, was a long-term endeavor. Today had been a significant milestone, but it was only one step in the ongoing process of earning credibility, navigating resistance, and asserting influence. As night fell over Fort Liberty, the base quieted. The lights dimmed in the barracks, the training grounds were empty, and the distant hum of vehicles faded into silence. Emily prepared for the next day, mentally reviewing contingencies, potential challenges, and ways to continue building influence. The challenge had been met successfully, but she knew the journey was far from over. Captain Emily Harris had faced her first truly high-stakes challenge, a scenario designed to overwhelm her authority, test her adaptability, and highlight potential weaknesses. Yet she had not only survived, but excelled, earning the quiet respect of soldiers and subtly undermining the colonel's attempts to belittle her. The challenge had been formidable, but it was now clear. Emily was not just a capable officer. She was a leader in her own right, capable of guiding her team through complexity and uncertainty with precision, calm, and unwavering focus. Tomorrow would bring new obstacles, new tensions, and perhaps a more direct confrontation with the colonel. But Emily was ready. She had demonstrated resilience under pressure, strategic thinking in the face of adversity, and a quiet authority that inspired confidence in her subordinates. The challenge was won, and the base had taken notice. Yet she knew that leadership was not static. It required continuous effort, observation, and adaptation. For Emily Harris, this exercise was more than a simulation. It was a proving ground, and she had passed with distinction. Fort Liberty would remember this day, the day a capable, calm, and brilliant officer earned the respect of her peers and forced even the most skeptical to acknowledge her undeniable talent. The days at Fort Liberty had begun to carry a new rhythm, one shaped subtly but unmistakably by Captain Emily Harris. The once rigid, skeptical atmosphere of the base was evolving, though only those with sharp eyes could perceive the shifts. Soldiers no longer hesitated at her commands. They moved with quiet confidence, trusting her judgment. Officers who had once questioned her authority now sought her input, recognizing that her insights were rooted in logic, precision, and experience. The ripple effects of her leadership were spreading beyond tactical exercises. They were beginning to transform the culture itself. Emily noticed the changes with careful observation. Morning drills, once tense and hesitant, now ran with an efficiency that had not been seen before. Troops executed maneuvers with coordination and discipline, guided by the principles she had modeled over the past weeks. She didn't interfere unnecessarily, allowing soldiers to make minor adjustments and learn from small errors. This approach encouraged autonomy while maintaining structure, a balance that had initially seemed impossible on a base steeped in tradition and hierarchy. The Colonel Mason remained a looming presence, his pride quietly bruised, but his authority intact. Yet even he could not ignore the undeniable results. Emily's influence had reshaped perceptions in subtle ways. Soldiers were more confident, exercises were executed with greater precision, and morale was visibly higher. He began to adjust his interactions with her, testing her judgment less aggressively, though he still interjected with measured challenges. These were now met with calm, analytical responses that highlighted her skill rather than her defiance. One particular morning brought a turning point that solidified her lasting impact. The base received news of a surprise operational assessment from higher command, a sudden inspection meant to evaluate preparedness across multiple levels. Panic would have been the expected response under the old regime, but Emily remained composed. She immediately convened her teams, delegating responsibilities based on previous observations of competence and reliability. Her calm authority filtered through the ranks, transforming initial anxiety into focused efficiency. During the assessment, the results were striking. Emily's units executed each protocol flawlessly, anticipating challenges and responding to contingencies with precision. Reports were prepared accurately. Communications were clear and uninterrupted, and troop coordination exceeded expectations. Even officers loyal to the colonel could not dispute the effectiveness of her methods. The inspection ended with formal acknowledgement from the visiting commanders, who praised the base for its readiness, a direct reflection of Emily's influence. The effects of her leadership extended beyond immediate operations. Soldiers began emulating her approach: thoughtful observation, careful planning, and calm decision-making under pressure. Small changes, previously discouraged or ignored, became normalized. Feedback was welcomed rather than feared, and minor mistakes were treated as opportunities for learning rather than grounds for punishment. The base, once rigid and resistant to innovation, began to embrace a culture of continuous improvement. Emily had planted the seeds, and they were beginning to flourish. Even the colonel's attitude toward her began to evolve, though grudgingly. Mason was still protective of his authority, yet he began to consult her on decisions that involved tactical planning or logistical coordination. His challenges became less about undermining and more about testing ideas collaboratively, a shift that Emily recognized as a subtle acknowledgement of her capability. Their dynamic, once marked by tension and skepticism, was slowly transitioning into a professional, if cautious, mutual respect. Emily's impact also reached her peers. Officers who had initially questioned her competence now regarded her as a mentor of sorts. She offered guidance, shared insights from her previous experiences, and provided frameworks for problem-solving that were both practical and effective. This mentorship was not overt or self-serving. It was rooted in a desire to elevate the performance of the base as a whole. Slowly, Emily was shaping not only individual soldiers, but the leadership culture itself. Outside the formal exercises, Emily's presence influenced daily routines. Soldiers began to approach challenges with initiative rather than hesitation, motivated by the example she had set. Training sessions became more collaborative, with troops offering suggestions and refining tactics collectively. Even minor victories, such as the successful execution of complex drills, were now acknowledged collectively, fostering a sense of pride and ownership across the base. Emily's leadership had created an environment where respect was earned through action and competence rather than imposed by rank alone. Her lasting impact was perhaps most evident during an unscheduled, high-pressure scenario that arose unexpectedly one evening. A simulated communication blackout challenged the entire base, creating confusion and potential operational failure. Troops, conditioned by Emily's leadership, responded calmly. Officers coordinated effectively, subordinates followed protocols without hesitation, and decision-making flowed smoothly from the top down. Emily guided from both observation and strategic intervention, ensuring that the simulated crisis was contained efficiently. The exercise, though unplanned, became a testament to the enduring influence of her methods. The soldiers' recognition of her leadership was now open and consistent. In informal conversations, troops spoke of her decisiveness, her clarity under pressure, and her ability to inspire confidence without demanding it. Words like composed, strategic, and reliable became commonly associated with her name. Even those who had initially resisted her presence admitted, in private, that she had fundamentally changed how they approached their duties. Emily's influence was no longer temporary or conditional. It was becoming an integral part of the base's operational fabric. Colonel Mason, observing this shift, could not suppress a begrudging acknowledgement. He continued to challenge her strategically, but his confrontations were no longer designed to belittle. They were now intellectual duels, testing ideas rather than undermining authority. Mason's recognition, though subtle, was significant. It represented the first true acknowledgement that Emily Harris had established herself not only as a capable officer, but as a transformative presence at Fort Liberty. Even administrative officers, previously skeptical, began to adopt her organizational approaches. Reports were streamlined, logistical coordination improved, and efficiency across daily operations increased measurably. Emily's influence had begun to permeate every level of the base, from training exercises to administrative procedures. Her impact was holistic, transforming the environment from one defined by rigidity and skepticism into one shaped by competence, adaptability, and collective confidence. As evening fell over Fort Liberty, Emily walked through the training grounds, observing soldiers as they prepared for routine drills. Their movements were precise, coordinated, and self-assured. The whispers of doubt that had once greeted her arrival were now replaced by quiet admiration and acknowledgement. She had shifted the base's culture subtly but irreversibly. Her leadership had created an environment where competence was respected, initiative was encouraged, and confidence was cultivated through example. Sitting in her quarters later that night, Emily reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From the initial skepticism of the colonel to the whispered doubts of soldiers, every challenge had been a test of patience, strategy, and composure. She had met each trial with careful observation, calm decisiveness, and a commitment to consistent performance. The base had responded slowly but unmistakably, and the seeds of lasting change had been firmly planted. Captain Emily Harris had achieved more than operational success. She had reshaped the culture of Fort Liberty. Soldiers now trusted her judgment, officers sought her insight, and even the colonel had begun to acknowledge her influence. Her impact was no longer confined to individual exercises or isolated victories. It was systemic, extending across the base and influencing attitudes, behaviors, and the very fabric of leadership. Emily had become a catalyst for change, demonstrating that authority grounded in competence and integrity could inspire trust, respect, and lasting influence. As the night deepened and silence settled across the barracks, Emily prepared for rest, fully aware that challenges would continue. Yet she also understood a fundamental truth. Influence earned through action, composure, and strategic vision endures. The lasting impact she had begun to cultivate at Fort Liberty would shape the base's operations, culture, and leadership long after the immediate exercises had concluded. Captain Emily Harris had not only survived skepticism and opposition, she had transformed it into an enduring legacy. The final week of the month brought a palpable tension to Fort Liberty, unlike any Emily Harris had experienced before. A high-level inspection from the Pentagon was scheduled, a comprehensive review of the base's operational readiness, strategic capabilities, and leadership efficiency. Soldiers moved with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension, knowing that the exercise would test every skill Emily had cultivated in her teams. But unlike previous drills, this was public, permanent, and would be scrutinized by external commanders whose judgment could impact careers, promotions, and reputations. Emily approached the morning with her usual calm precision. Every plan had contingencies. Every unit had clearly defined responsibilities, and every officer had been coached to anticipate dynamic scenarios. Her past weeks of challenges, confrontations with the colonel, and the evolution of the base's culture had prepared her for this moment. She walked the parade ground, observing soldiers as they conducted last-minute drills. Their movements were coordinated, confident, and efficient, a tangible reflection of her leadership. Colonel Mason stood nearby, his posture rigid, eyes scanning the preparations with a mix of scrutiny and thinly veiled concern. He had witnessed her growth, her successes, and the respect she had quietly earned among the troops. Yet, Mason's pride prevented him from openly acknowledging it. His every gesture, from the slight narrowing of his eyes to the faint tilt of his jaw, betrayed a simmering awareness. Captain Harris was no ordinary officer. She had challenged the status quo, and now, The base itself was a reflection of her influence. The inspection began with formal reviews. Senior officers from the Pentagon observed as units demonstrated their operational capabilities under Emily's coordination. What could have been a tense, brittle display instead became a testament to disciplined leadership and effective preparation. Soldiers executed drills with precision. Officers articulated strategies confidently, and the flow of operations was seamless. Emily moved among the teams, giving guidance when necessary, but largely observing, allowing her influence to manifest through the actions of those she had trained and inspired. During a particularly complex exercise, an unexpected scenario was introduced. Multiple simulated emergencies occurring simultaneously, a communications failure, a logistical bottleneck, and a sudden security breach. Soldiers hesitated briefly, a natural reaction under pressure, but Emily's calm presence immediately stabilized the situation. Her voice carried across the training grounds, measured and clear, directing resources, reallocating responsibilities, and coordinating responses with fluid efficiency. Within moments, what could have been chaos transformed into coordinated action. The observers from the Pentagon watched intently. Notes were taken, eyebrows raised, and subtle nods exchanged. Emily's team had not only maintained operational integrity, but had adapted dynamically to challenges, demonstrating initiative, critical thinking, and cohesion. The inspections were designed to test leadership under duress, and Emily's performance exceeded expectations. Even the colonel's loyalists could not deny the effectiveness of her command. After the formal exercises, a debriefing session was held in the main operations room. Officers presented outcomes, insights, and lessons learned, with Emily guiding the discussion. Her analysis was precise and insightful, highlighting both strengths and areas for improvement, without casting blame. Soldiers spoke openly, offering observations and feedback, a practice that had been rare prior to her influence. The room was filled with a sense of collaboration, mutual respect, and shared purpose, a reflection of the lasting impact Emily had cultivated on the base. Colonel Mason, seated at the edge of the room, observed quietly. For the first time, his expression softened ever so slightly, acknowledging, if only internally, the transformation Emily had achieved. He had attempted to belittle her, undermine her authority, and challenge her at every turn. Yet she had turned every obstacle into an opportunity to assert competence, inspire trust, and elevate the operational readiness of Fort Liberty. Mason's authority remained intact, but Emily's presence had now become a defining element of the base's leadership landscape. Later that afternoon, during a ceremonial recognition, the Pentagon representatives spoke. They commended the base for its preparedness, coordination, and efficiency under pressure. Specific attention was given to the leadership demonstrated by Captain Emily Harris. While her praise was formal and measured, it carried undeniable weight. Soldiers and officers alike recognized the significance. Emily's influence had not only improved operational performance, but had reshaped perceptions of leadership, authority, and competence across Fort Liberty. The colonel, standing nearby, addressed the assembly. His tone was controlled but genuine, a rare mixture of authority and acknowledgement. Captain Harris has demonstrated exceptional leadership, he stated. His words, though carefully chosen, carried undeniable validation. The room absorbed the statement. Soldiers exchanged quiet glances, officers straightened, and a wave of respect rippled through the assembled personnel. Mason's recognition, grudging as it was, marked a turning point, not only for Emily, but for the base as a whole. Emily stood quietly as the ceremony concluded, absorbing the significance of the moment. The base that had greeted her arrival with skepticism, whispers, and resistance was now operating with confidence, cohesion, and respect. She had transformed doubt into trust, resistance into compliance, and subtle skepticism into open admiration. The journey had been arduous, Deliberate challenges, personal tests, and constant scrutiny had shaped her strategy and strengthened her resolve. Yet the results were now undeniable. In the following days, the lasting impact of her leadership became even more apparent. Training routines were smoother, decision-making processes were faster and more efficient, and soldiers displayed initiative without fear of reprisal. Emily's influence had permeated both the operational and cultural layers of the base. What had begun as individual competence had evolved into collective capability. The soldiers now mirrored her calm decisiveness, thoughtful analysis, and disciplined execution. Even the colonel's approach shifted subtly. While maintaining authority, Mason began engaging in collaborative discussions with Emily, seeking insight and considering her perspectives. He had recognized a fundamental truth: leadership could be multifaceted. Authority and rank were important, but influence earned through competence, consistency, and composure carried its own undeniable weight. Emily's presence had challenged and reshaped not only the base, but also Mason's understanding of leadership dynamics. One evening, as the base settled into relative quiet, Emily walked through the parade grounds alone. The soldiers were returning from drills. Conversations were lively but disciplined, and a sense of purpose permeated the air. She paused briefly, taking in the scene, the coordinated movements, the subtle acknowledgement in the eyes of soldiers, the quiet efficiency that had become the new norm. This was the culmination of her efforts, a transformation that extended far beyond exercises, reports, or formal recognition. She had left an indelible mark on the base itself. Emily reflected on the journey, the initial skepticism, the challenges posed by the colonel, the whispers of doubt, and the strategic obstacles that had tested her patience, composure, and tactical acumen. Every trial had strengthened her. Every setback had provided insight, and every success had reinforced credibility. Fort Liberty was no longer the rigid, doubtful environment it had once been. It had evolved into a place where competence inspired trust, strategy drove efficiency, and leadership earned respect. Captain Emily Harris had achieved more than professional recognition. She had created a legacy of influence that would endure, shaping the base's culture, operational excellence, and perception of leadership for years to come. Soldiers who had once doubted her would carry her methods forward. Officers would integrate her strategies into daily operations. And even the colonel would remember the officer who had quietly, decisively, and effectively transformed Fort Liberty from within. As night fell, Emily returned to her quarters, exhausted yet fulfilled. The journey had been arduous, filled with tests, challenges, and subtle battles of authority. But the outcome was undeniable. She had emerged not only as a respected leader, but as a transformative presence, one whose influence would endure beyond her immediate tenure. The whispers of doubt had been replaced by acknowledgement. Skepticism had been transformed into admiration, and resistance had given way to lasting trust. In that quiet moment, Captain Emily Harris understood the essence of her accomplishment. Leadership was not about commanding respect. It was about earning it through consistent action, composure, and integrity. Authority could be challenged, obstacles could arise, and opposition could test even the most capable officer. Yet true leadership, demonstrated through competence and calm decisiveness, left an impact that could not be erased. Fort Liberty had witnessed that truth firsthand.